So this is going to be an introduction to jQuery. A lot of these things we've gone over already. One of the things that we're going to look at here is a couple of these terms which you've seen already. I apologize. Something's a little funky with my machine. So we've looked a little bit at the document object model, the fact that things are happening inside of a tree. The only time that we're going to talk about things being, we're really going to talk about the DOM for the most part, is just when we're talking about client-side code. But that's really where the DOM lives. Right? When we talk about client-side code, we talk about the browser. And again, when a web page is loaded, we have this DOM that's available to us, and this DOM is available to be manipulated. So the other thing that we'll look at when we look at jQuery is how to select, various elements that are on the page. So when we talk about front-end applications, we're going to be talking about manipulating user interfaces, or really user interfaces. And really what we're going to be doing is we're going to be manipulating the DOM based on interactivity with the user. Not necessarily always. I mean, you could think about if you had a site that was showing a list of stock prices or something like that, and you wanted to show those changes. I mean, we might end up doing that with WebSockets. We might end up doing that with just some sort of polling, okay? But for the most part, usually it's some user interaction that's going to cause us to manipulate the DOM. So this is a cartoon of somebody who's important, I guess. The fact of the matter is that when we talk about making requests, right, we've ended up using Express. We're talking about taking this file and sending back this HTML page. So, well, render. Who wants to answer that? Mitch.
The set file is static file. All the bits there are predefined. Render basically says, I'm going to make that on the fly based off of maybe another file, some various input, and then send it.
Well, the key word here is that send file is just going to output the file. Render is going to use a template engine. Okay?
The file is an HTML file, or it's defined, say, downloading some file?
Could be a different file as well. I mean, usually, if it's a browser and someone's requesting a page, it depends on how the request is getting made. It's up to you. So, here we've got a page that ends up getting parsed. We could have a style sheet that's on that page, right? In which case we'd be sending these styles back. We could end up having a script tag here, in which case we'd have a request that go for these script tags. We've seen how we can end up setting up static routes to return these things, whether they are style sheets here or script files, assuming that we have them in this public directory. We could end up creating a static route. So we've got JavaScript files which would come to the server, right to the browser. So when we talk about front-end JavaScript, is we've used some back-end JavaScript up to this point, right? We've done a fair amount with back-end JavaScript. All of our Express stuff has been back-end. But when we talk about front-end JavaScript, this is code that's going to be running in the browser. Once that code ends up coming in to the browser, that interactivity with the server is really gone. This is code that's going to be executed in a different environment. As a result of that, there are things that you could do on the server, and there are things that you could end up doing on the client. Okay? On the server, you could end up reading another file on the server. You could end up sending back a file. You could make a call to your database. Okay? On the client, those are things that you can't do, but you could do things like manipulating the DOM. It's basically the same language, but operating in a different environment. If you remember the sort of examples that we looked at before, it's like having a different kitchen with different things that you could end up doing, although you're using the same language. So the thing that makes this a little bit tricky is the fact that you could end up having this server that's in a totally different environment serving to all these other different browsers. And the fact is that when you're running your Node application, you have control over what the Node environment is. Let's actually be a little bit clear about that. When you're running locally, you have that control. If you went to deploy that somewhere, this is going to be the Node environment where you're going to deploy it to. But the point is that you have no control over what browsers are going to be making requests to your server. What that really gets at is that these browsers can have different functionalities. Okay? Not all browsers are created equal. Even though browsers are supposed to respect different standards, they don't follow them exactly. What this ends up resulting in is that you have cross-browser concerns. Okay? This has become a lot less of an issue, really, in recent years as browsers have gotten a little bit closer to implementing different standards, but it still is a concern. So this is not something that you have to worry about when you're writing your server-side code, but when you're writing your client-side code, you could be dealing with not only all these different vendors, but on top of that, you could also be looking at them doing things on different devices as well, and it can be kind of disheartening to write your JavaScript code to deal with all these things. So here's an example where if you wanted to get the style of an element, there could be all different ways that different browsers would end up going and manipulating this. And it became a little bit of a hassle, and you would see code that looked like this. So there's actually a typo on this code. So what you would end up seeing is that JavaScript allows you to basically find out the truthiness of if something exists. So you would say, hey, look, if my DOM element understands what getComputedStyle is, I'm going to end up using it. Otherwise, this is actually incorrect. These parentheses shouldn't be here. Otherwise, if it knows what current style is, I'm going to use current style. Otherwise, if it knows what runtime style is, I'm going to use that. And don't kid yourself, this is the way that a lot of code used to work. Bottom line is that browsers do some things differently. Not exactly everything, but they can do things differently in terms of how elements end up getting selected. They could also do things differently in terms of the styles that you end up putting on elements. And they also do things different based on the available APIs that you have. So what's an example of APIs? Well, certain browsers will end up implementing certain APIs. Certain browsers won't end up implementing certain APIs. An API might be the Canvas API. An API might be local storage. These are all browser features that some are more standardized than others. So jQuery doesn't totally end up solving this problem, but it does help. So one of the things that you can end up doing with jQuery is that, and we didn't end up doing this, but if you wanted to basically add a style to an element in jQuery, again, this we covered before, this $ with the selector. What does this end up giving us? Remember the word I used for this? Words? Wrapped set. Okay? It gives us a wrapped set, and now we can add a class to it. So we don't have to basically say, hey, look, we don't care what the internal implementation of setting styles are. We can just basically say add class. So what jQuery does, it ends up basically providing an abstraction. Okay? In the end, the only thing that can manipulate the DOM is native DOM methods. jQuery is wrapping around that, and we did that. We ended up doing that when we ended up working with selector. Okay? That was basically our way of creating selectors. So jQuery was really a huge thing when it ended up coming along. In fact, you would end up seeing this code. It was really difficult to write anything that was cross-browser. This was a couple of different reasons. I mean, one of them was that even if there were only two browsers around, they did things totally different. Okay? So you basically almost have to have two code bases for these two different browsers. And this really turned out to be an incredibly big challenge. And jQuery saved that by abstracting out a lot of these things. So these are all examples of selecting elements, right? These are all different selectors. If we were to go and look at these selectors, this would be selecting all of the H1 tags. This would be selecting all the elements. And I think this will only actually return one. Like I said, this might have changed at some point. But this is going to be basically getting an element by ID. This would be selecting based on what? Class. And this is going to be selecting by any spans that are underneath an H1. So again, if you know how to do selectors in CSS, you know how to do them with jQuery. So we looked at this before, right? We could basically take something, the way that this would end up reading is find all the elements on the page that have a class of BTN and attach this event handler to them. One of the things that we've seen is what we end up getting back in this is going to be our DOM element. So on is actually a jQuery method, okay? So the way to sort of think about this, a lot of these jQuery methods are these chained methods, right? So you end up getting your wrap set, okay? Could be a wrap set of 0, could be a wrap set of 1, wrap set of however many elements you have on the page with a class of button, and here you're basically attaching your event handler to them. What event handler click? There's also other event handlers you can do. You can do mouse over. You can do mouse out. I think jQuery even ends up implementing a double click if you wanted to use something like that. So here's an example of any number of event handlers that you can end up using. So here's an example of some jQuery. So here, if we have this author profile, we've got an author name underneath it. One of the things that you'll often end up doing, and again, you don't necessarily have to turn into an expert off the bat with jQuery. In fact, when you start using these frameworks like we're going to end up doing with React, you can have a heck of a lot less of a need to use it, although a lot of places they're going to be at, they're going to use some form of jQuery. It's still pretty common out there. You can look at statistics of how often libraries are being used. You can find that this is a pretty widely used library. The way that this would end up working is that we would be basically getting all the elements on the page that have a class of .author profile. Okay? And this is basically going to get us all of their children elements. We could maybe make the case here that if we only had one author profile on the page, this is now going to give us a wrapped set of all these child elements. So if we ended up doing this is, again, a bunch of different ways to do the same thing. If you ended up getting the children elements, one of the things you could do is you could pass to children something more specific. And what that's doing is basically saying, here's your starting point. I'm going to give you another wrapped set of author name. And this is going to be a wrapped set that contains one element. If you use the capital A instead of a lowercase a, you'd get 0. Okay? On the same token, right, if you said $.genre and you said parent, you'd go back up to author profile. The way that jQuery actually separates these things out, this all falls under the category of traversing the DOM. jQuery gives the ability to take a DOM element, okay, and if you weren't able to select exactly what you wanted, for whatever reason, you could traverse the DOM. If you're sitting on this element, this allows you to go back up and get the parent, in which case, again, you've got this wrapped set that contains exactly one element. On the same token, we've seen this already, right? If we end up taking genre and we end up getting the siblings, this allows us to basically just get everything other than genre. And you can end up seeing that here. Another example here is that if we end up the same way that we would end up doing a selector in CSS, okay, we could actually start out with the class of titles and get all the list items underneath it, in which case this would end up giving us a wrapped set of these 3 elements that we can end up manipulating or attaching event handlers or doing whatever we wanted to. So here's an example of what would be called chaining. So chaining allows us to basically say, hey, look, here's my wrapped set. Let me call a jQuery method on it. The same way that on ends up getting called on a wrapped set, CSS could end up getting called on a wrapped set. And what this would end up doing is it would basically put in inline styles to make all these list items red. Okay? You can do the same thing with classes if you want to, but again, the CSS method basically takes an object. We're very familiar with object. Objects have keys and values, and you can set whatever CSS properties you want it to set on this. So we've got this whole idea of this sort of implicit looping. What do we mean by that? That means that if we end up getting these titles, and all we're doing here is we're setting up, this is a naming convention where you're saying, hey, look, this is my jQuery wrapped set of all my titles, and there's an implicit looping that's going on here. Because what it's going to end up doing is it's going to take all those titles and it's going to modify them. You can literally go in and look at the DOM and see that you're modifying the width of all these titles here with this implicit looping. On the same token here, right, you could end up getting these titles. You could end up modifying the text property of these things. This is kind of an interesting one here. This, I think actually I would also call this a typo as well. So here, if you ended up getting the, what would this end up returning? My guess. So if this was a wrap set, my guess is when you end up calling this text value on this, my guess is it's actually just going to give you the text value from the first selection that you have here. I think really what's missing from this is that if you wanted to change the text value, you could do that. The same thing here, if you have the titles, you could get the children from these titles as well. You also have the ability to do explicit looping. No, that's just convention. Yeah, and frankly, I haven't really done that all that much. I think I've only seen that on these slides. You also have the ability, if you have a jQuery wrapped set, okay, and this used to be really one of the coolest things because, you know, when jQuery first came out, you didn't have a for each on an array anyway. Okay, so what jQuery would allow you to do is that jQuery said, hey, look, here's your wrapped set. You can end up iterating over each of these items. Okay? In which case, you'd probably want to use your parentheses to catch that item and then manipulate it. So here's an example of, let's say we have this jukebox. And what we could end up doing here is we could end up going and we could end up finding these buttons, and we could set up event handlers for these buttons. And again, you don't have to necessarily do find on this. You could theoretically just say pound jukebox space button, which I think would read a little bit cleaner. But this is the same way to do this. Again, in the end, jQuery allows you to get to the same place a bunch of different ways. What this would end up doing is basically giving you a wrapped set of these 3 buttons that are on the page. But the thing that becomes a little bit more interesting here, or actually this is something we've seen already, is that if we end up looking at what this points to, we wanted to turn this thing into a jQuery object. We basically use the $sign, but a little bit differently. We use the $sign to really cast this DOM element as a wrap set. So this is some other inside thing that I'm not really that aware of. I know all about it. I just don't want to act like I'm hip. So let's actually just look at a few different things here. Okay, we're going to use the $ a few different ways. You've seen all these already. You've seen that what we can do is we could actually use the $ to find elements. So here we're using the $ as a selector. Right? So if it looks like a CSS selector, that's actually what you're using the $ here for. You could also use the $ to go and to create a DOM element. Okay? The thing that's interesting about this is that behind the scenes, what you're using is the document object has a method called createElement that you could end up using. Okay? That's actually happening behind the scenes. This is not being added anywhere to the DOM. Okay? We're going to have to append it somewhere to actually get it to work. The other thing that we've seen is we have the ability to do casting where we could actually take a regular DOM element and turn it into a jQuery collection. So we take this example before where we're going over here and we want to set up some event handler on this. And this is something that we ended up investigating, is that if it turns out that we end up adding in some buttons dynamically, how do we want to make sure that they end up getting wired up? And one way to do it, which is something that we've seen before, is to actually say, hey, look, I'm going to put the event handler on the parent element, but I'm going to be specific and say, within the context of that parent element, what I'm really interested in is the button. And that allows us to basically wire up these elements before they're added to the DOM. So just as a recap, right, this is a client-side JavaScript library, DOM selection, event handling, managing properties. Again, the way to sort of think about some of these things, if you look at the jQuery documentation, you'll see that there's an area on manipulating the DOM, on traversing the DOM. jQuery also has a bunch of AJAX methods that you can end up using. jQuery has, there's a section on how to manipulate styles. There's a section on animation and all these things. Again, one of the things that's happened is it's fell a bit out of favor with these single-page applications. But again, it's important to see this. You will see it. And some of these other client-side frameworks can actually be built on top of jQuery as well. So it's still got a large slot in the industry, and it's still a better solution and a simpler solution for something that's not as complicated. But again, a lot of what it's gotten replaced by is going to be things like Angular and things like React. Okay, let me stop this.